not to touch.
Thank you. It's really a privilege to be here. I feel very welcomed by our hosts, and thank you to the chair of this most august house. This is truly amazing. I want to open this debate by essentially defining and clarifying what we mean by the decline of U.S. economic dominance. I think our friends on this side would like to pin us down and force us to defend an argument that we think the U.S. should currently maintain or even increase its share of global GDP. We don't want to have to defend this because it's not a very pretty argument to have to defend. We don't want to have to defend that the United States should remain wealthy or whatever than the rest of the world. Essentially, what we are going to be defending on our side of the House is that while the U.S. share of global GDP may decline, we would support the continued dominance of U.S. ideas and institutional types essentially promulgated by the United States government, by businessmen and women within the United States, and by U.S. institutions. What we tell you is that dominance, or U.S. economic dominance as it now exists, is not Barack Obama standing up in front of the world and saying, you will all do this, the U.S. government handing down decisions to the rest of the planet. What we tell you is this is a general percolation and influence of American ideas, markets, and exchanges that influence the entire world, and American businesses backed up by a few select government policies. Our second president, John Adams, said that the United States is a nation of ideas and of laws, not of men, and we think that's incredibly important. What the U.S. is exporting, what the U.S. influence actually means, is the U.S. wants its ideas to go around, essentially go around the world and back up free market policies, and we think these are generally good things. We tell you that this kind of economic dominance is not like the Roman Empire, where it only exists for the benefit of the United States. We think that this dominance has come with substantial benefits to the entire world as a whole. It's not for America's benefit only, nor is it like the mercantilist policies of the 18th century. We think that United States policy generally promotes free trade. There are a few exceptions. The only times, or the only significant times, when we think the United States uses its political influence or uses economic controls for political influence is in the very few cases of strategic economic sanctions, and those mainly against countries that are gross violators of human rights. I'll take you at the end of this point, such as Sudan or Iran. Go ahead.
What's strategic about corn subsidies that are totally undoing the Mexican Revolution and making people starve in Mexico? What's strategic there?
Food security for the entire world. We think that's strategic. We think it's helped the United States. We think it's helped the United States stay away from starvation, and the U.S. is also exporting basically agricultural technology that will lead the world to be more food secure and try and wean Mexico away from a subsistence economy and into a more industrialized world where people can actually know where their next bag of flour is coming from. We think this is incredibly important. We also say that the United States promotes agreements such as NAFTA and various other trade pacts, which are wonderful things with Australia, countries all around the world. The United States policy and dominance in the economic arena has led towards a general reduction of tariffs around the world and an opening of free trade in isolated markets in Africa and Asia around the planet, places where we think economic development would not have come as quickly and where people would be starving if it weren't for the open market policies that the U.S. has promoted. We also tell you the United States Navy is the first, and foremost, are most active in battling and stopping Somali piracy, keeping shipping lanes open for the entire planet, and the U.S. is staunch in its opposition to China and trying to keep the internet open and a free forum of ideas for the entire world. This is a wonderful thing. We are promoting, or the United States is promoting, not just free trade, but also free speech. Finally, the United States is promoting the growth of other economies. U.S. companies outsource. There exist tax incentives. This is a pretty heated discussion in the political arena in the United States right now, that there are tax credits for companies that actually send jobs overseas to places like India. So this is pretty clear evidence of the United States not doing this merely for their own influence and for their own benefit. And finally, we think that the United States educational system has these PhD programs especially, which take students from all over the world and export brain power to the rest of the planet. This is evidenced by the fact that none of the grad students that teach my classes actually speak English, and therefore we have a lot of trouble understanding what we're supposed to be learning at Harvard because all of the people are from Greece or China or Argentina and places like that. So essentially, now that I think I've pretty clearly explained what the benefits are of the current U.S. system. And I think I've made it clear that it's not the U.S. government dictating policy. A lot of these things are carried out by U.S. businesses. For example, the internet, which has minimal influence from the government. But we want to tell you furthermore that I think the side that is arguing in favor of the motion actually needs to provide some kind of viable alternative. And their first speaker tried to squirrel his way out of this by saying, we just support some kind of world that has no one dominant economic player. We don't think this is really possible. If the U.S. falls, somebody is going to take its place, and we'll give you 4 alternatives. The first one, perhaps China. China, which is poised to be the largest market in the world in a couple of decades. The Chinese, do we really want, we ask you, the Chinese government or state-owned firms buying up Earth's resources and occasionally or basically bankrolling things like the Janjaweed to promote a genocide in Sudan just because China wants more strategic oil reserves? We think that, I'll take you in 1 second, the United States, when it does go and take control of strategic resources, limits that to like uranium, not all the world's iron ore and neodymium and oil. Go ahead.
Given that the USA bankrolled the Taliban for political ends, do you think
In retrospect, probably a mistake. But we don't have to defend perfection, and we don't have to claim perfection. All we have to claim is that it was the best, or it is the best option that is out there. And we think perhaps the Taliban at the time, before they started promoting these extreme philosophies around the world, were probably a better alternative than Soviet imperialism in Central Asia. That's the first option, the first alternative, Chinese state-owned firms and government policy. The second, maybe Russian kleptocracy, corruptly dividing up the Earth's resources, and occasionally the Kremlin arresting or assassinating, oh God, this is recorded, arresting or assassinating people they find politically unsavory. A third alternative, perhaps OPEC, establishing Sharia law in the Middle East or Chavez-style restrictions on free speech in Latin America merely because they happen to control the world's energy. Or perhaps a fourth alternative, the EU, if it can get its act together and prevent Greece from being insolvent. Perhaps, the EU with its mercantilist policies and subsidizing Airbus and having these, free trade restrictions and laws on where different alcohol can be produced and cheese grown and things like that. We don't think that the EU is actually providing a more viable free market alternative than the United States. With my remaining time, I want to basically address a few things that were brought up by our first speaker here. He tells us that the U.S. economy is based on consumption. The U.S. economic dominance is based on consumption. First, we tell you it's based on a huge service economy, largely education and innovation, technology, which actually helps make the world a better place, drugs and science and things like that. They tell us that the U.S. hogs resources. We argue not more per capita than Australia or a lot of other places. Essentially, all they're arguing is they hate the developed world, and they're just angry that the U.S. is the largest member of the developed world. They argue that impoverishing the United States will lead to an environmentally better world. This is not true. We look to countries like Japan and the Netherlands, which have huge amounts of GDP per capita and yet are generally very clean, versus China and Mexico, which are the opposite on both counts. They tell us there's a whole lack of regulation which has led to the current economic crisis and fiscal disaster. We don't think that it was worse in the United States. The U.S. was actually far more resilient than it would have been in other forms. For example, witness Dubai. We think that would be worse for the world. He says, diversify your holdings. Go away from the dollar. But the dollar is the strongest and safest currency investment right now. We think it seems to be pretty much fine. And essentially, and his last argument is that protectionism is good because of a single example of the South Korean steel industry. We think that liberalization in India, China under Deng Xiaoping, these have shown fantastic examples of economic growth. And finally, we mention once again that they really do need to provide an alternative, because if the U.S. falls, there will be someone else to take its place. And this could be any of the countries I've listed. And we also think that this holds not just in the whole economic arena, but in the example of AIDS donations. So should we just cut off all AIDS donations because we're not willing to have these restrictions, or not have any donations to the IMF because we think it promotes slightly unsavory policies? For all these reasons, we're proud to oppose. Thank you.
The next speaker on behalf of
easy, wasn't it, really? I mean, he stood up here and he told us, I'm not going to defend our actions. I'm not going to defend anything we've done. I'll defend our ideals, but I'll pick and choose what ideals I say America stands for. And so I POI'd him and I asked him, I said, what about NAFTA? What about what you've done to the Mexicans? What about the fact that when they got together and they got their cooperatives and they tried to get agribusiness up and they tried to give themselves some food security? What about the fact that you prioritised tying your own citizens to land, tying things like the soybean crops, like corn crops, over them? You know, that's an example of protectionism which he is against. But he says, no, America never engages in protectionism. Niall tells you about the steel workers. Like, basically our argument is all the powers that he talks about, all the people we should fear stepping into this vacuum that the removal of American dominance will create, all of them are in favour of free trade, right? To say that the US has a monopoly on free trade is an outright lie. What Niall was pointing out is that there are occasions, particularly with nascent economies, when they need some protectionist measures in order to get up to a standard in which they can compete on a global level. We think these kind of things are perfectly legitimate to prioritise. And the problem with the Washington Consensus is that that mandates that people sell off their assets, that governments sell off their assets at the cheapest possible price. And guess who generally buys them? The US companies that he talks about benefiting the world as a whole. In terms of the other scare tactics he told us, well, the Russians might rule the world and then no one will be safe in their beds. Oh my God. I say Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, the US isn't the garter of human rights in the world anymore. Certainly they haven't been in recent times. He tells you China means that we will never, ever have a safe and clean environment. I say, look at the Chinese budget for next year. They are the biggest investors in green technology. China responds to market-driven demands. China is going to be leading us in green technology. So again, that is a fallacy. So what am I going to talk about? No, thank you. Okay. Right, basically, I'm going to tell you that it's time for the demise of the schizophrenic cop. We've no problem with America being a world actor. We just don't think they should be the sole world actor, and we welcome that. I'm going to look at America with regards to the IMF and the World Bank. I'm going to look at them in terms of neutering other international organizations, like the ICC, like the UN. And then I'm going to look at, this kind of argument they gave us. The best thing they could give us for America. Sure, isn't it better the devil you know? No. And then finally, I'm going to look at alternatives. But before that, no, thank you. But before that, I have some obligatory humor, because I was told to be funny. Right. Okay, so basically for the last 20, 30 years, American foreign and economic policy has been like a bad rerun of Pinky and the Brain. You know, what are we going to do tonight, George? Try to take over the world. And he tells us, no, it's all gotten better because we've a new guy. We've Obama. So yeah, the changed, updated version is, so what are we going to do tonight, Barack? I don't know. I'm thinking. I got it. Try to take over the world. Okay, so basically, increasingly world dominance in a real sense, in terms of foreign policy and stuff, has been linked to economics. This is for a number of factors. Military might is no longer an accurate determinator. If we look at Russia, if we look at Germany, if we look at Japan, nukes can't determine who's really ruling the world either, because unfortunately, some of our enemies have gotten them, and some of our allies don't have them. So quite simply, we've used trade and trade sanctions in order to kind of control people. And this debate is essentially about whether this unfettered US economic might is a good thing. Whether or not having the US as the sole kind of good cop or the sole cop in the world is beneficial, or whether or not we should have a temperance on that. What they need to prove is that America will always make the best decisions without having to rely on other people, without there being a cross-policy of views and things like that. We think that that's hugely unrealistic, because we think that, as Niall told you, America is hugely schizophrenic in terms of who is in charge at the moment. The problem with this, no, thank you. The problem with this is, if you look at, say, some of the things that America's done with the IMF. Okay, so America's the only one who is a voting, the majority voting rights in the IMF. They have 17%. They're the only ones who can block a proposal. And he tells us, well, that's because America gives the most money, and isn't that morally just? We say two things to that. One, China also wants to give more money. America blocks them from increasing their voting rights. So America aren't behaving fairly. But secondly, even if we're to look at what is morally right, maybe we should look at those who are affected most by the decisions. So he says, well, America gives the most money. It was the East Eastern Europeans who suffered massive increase in deaths from tuberculosis because of the policies that America forced them to adopt through the IMF. Like, there are a number of things like that that should be taken into consideration. And like, so if we adopted a more nuanced kind of like multi-actor approach, you will get regional actors playing a much bigger role. The reason why that is better is that you wouldn't have these kind of blanket policies. And also like having an approach where like a multitude of views are listened to means that you're more likely to get something that will work for everyone. Secondly, I'd say in terms of like the neutering of other international bodies, like the US as the global superpower has said, we're not going to sign up to the ICC. They said, like, everyone please respect human rights, but our guys, they're not going to be held by that at all. And like, they flaunted this in terms of what happened in Iraq. They flaunted this in terms of what's happened in Abu Ghraib. And he tells us, let's look to America for the ideals that they're exporting. The ideals that they're exporting at the moment is that power is what it matters at the end of the day. If you have the most money, if you have the most power, you don't have to be answerable to anyone. The problem with that is it filters into all sort of discourse in the international community. So when we try and criticize other actors for behaving in that manner, we have no moral standpoint, because that is exactly what America has done. And they've been able to do that because they haven't had that interdependency that other people have had. Yes.
Are you really for the dissolution of the United States? It sounds more like your side is arguing the US should reform itself along what Obama has promised.
No. Okay, first of all, this is again with this great hope theory, right? The US should reform, and Obama's promised it, and that isn't that great. Like Obama, like what Obama's promised. First of all, we don't know if Obama's going to be able to get all those through the Congress and stuff like that. But also, Obama's in office for the next 3 years, lads. Like there is no guarantee that he is in office past that. Like, and that is the massive problem. This is my third point in terms of like, is it better the devil you know? And we say no, right? Because that relies on two things. One, that America shares our values all the time, which they clearly don't. But secondly, the only way it's better the devil you know is if it's predictable. If the US, how US acts will be entirely predictable. The two parties in the US are polar opposites. They would be different countries, different continents often. Like if they were in Europe, they would be at least 6 or 7 different countries, right? The problem is, you then, like, so you get the Brits in power effectively one year and the French in power the next. Like, that is essentially the way the Republican Democratic thing breaks down. And so, like, you get this situation in which we have no idea what's going to happen. So like Bush comes out and he says, Iran, axis of evil, we won't talk to them. And Obama comes out and he says, well, we're going to send Clinton over there to talk to them. And then they say like, well, we support Israel unconditionally, and Obama says it through gritted teeth. Like they won't talk to North Korea, but Obama will. Like we don't know. Like if a Republican comes into power, are you honestly saying that they'll follow what Obama's laid out?
If I'm still allowed to talk, I would say, do you really believe that the UN will be less schizophrenic?
Okay, well, first of all, we never proposed the UN as the alternative actor. But again, you're missing the point, right? Like, you're saying that one global power is the best. Like having one guy in charge all the time, unfettered, unanswerable to everyone, is what we should be aiming for. We're saying having a dilution of power, having a number of actors is what we should be aiming for, and that's how you get the checks and balances. And this is the fourth one to have in terms of alternatives. The advantage for us in terms of the dilution of American power is we as Europeans increase our power. At the moment, our power is contingent on like America and things like that, and we say like we can become a bigger actor because we're one of many rather than being a lesser one to the USA. But more broadly speaking, you get much better moderation and bargaining positions because people actually talk issues out. We say, yes, decisions will probably take slightly longer if you're talking about the UN or the EU or actors like that, but you'll get more of a consensus decision, stuff like that. Like, in a nutshell, will America still tie their aid, and has America still every right to tie their aid to such lofty ambitions as abstinence and things like that? Sure, but people have other alternatives in terms of whether or not to accept them. And that's what we really think. We think people should have alternatives. We think there should be multiple opinions in the global stage. And on those grounds, we're proud to propose. Thank you.
To respond on behalf of Harvard's Alex Loomis.
Here.
Thank you, everyone in this most august house. I must start by saying I'm somewhat shocked by what side proposition has laid as our burden in this route. They say, we have to prove America will always be right. Everybody, okay? Nobody's always right. What we're going to argue is that a group of regional actors are certainly going to be less likely to be right, or at the very least, they're certainly going to accomplish less than the US ever has done. Now, when you do have one large economic superpower, just because you're the tallest guy in the room, you're going to attract a lot of mudslinging, just because you're everywhere around. That doesn't mean, however, that the US is the worst. In fact, I would even say that the US is probably one of the best superpowers that's even existed. Do I need to lecture Ireland on British, economic dominance? Come on, guys. We would tell you in general that the real distinction about American power is what Josh tells you, and what I don't think they did an adequate job of addressing. Namely, that US economic dominance is not about our country being in charge. It's a matter of the ideals of free trade dominating and the discourse of freedom going throughout the world. We believe that their alternative, which I'm not really quite sure is at this moment, is not going to allow this amount of freedom to be spread throughout the world quite as easily. So that said, I want to look at this debate through two different lenses. First, I want to look at what their alternative really is, because if you're looking at the fall of American power, this is a comparative debate. If we're welcoming the fall, we better be okay with what that actually entails. But second, I want to look at what exactly the fallout is going to be, or the specific consequences of the US fall from economic dominance. So they get up here, they say that they really support having regional actors in charge. Well, first of all, I'm not even sure they're going to have that option. I mean, as Josh tells you, China is going to be in charge economically in the next 10, 20 years. I don't think that China has a very good human rights policy. I'm not going to pretend that Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo are perfect, but at least they're not standard government policy, okay? And at least we throw out the people out of office when they committed them. At least we have some sort of moral qualms about committing those actions. None of this is true in China. Proposition gets up here and says, no, but China's awesome because they're so green. They're donating so much money to making themselves green. Guys, they're polluting the most. They're not really helping that much in terms of overall dominance. And in general, we would tell you that their economic policies haven't been about trying to promote a vision of liberal ideals across the world. Josh tells you this isn't entirely about economics either. Also part of having large-scale dominance is about promoting ideals of freedom, which includes free trade, but which also encourages other avenues. We don't think China is going to be as willing to clear the oceans to make sure that free trade can happen for all individuals. Why is this? Because China has made it clear that they're primarily concerned with their own interests. Now, yes, the US does oftentimes act in its own interests at the expense of the world community. But at the very least, we have some basic liberal ideals that the EU subscribes to as well that we try to promote. They might criticize us for attaching restrictions to the amount of AIDS funding that we give. First of all, we remove those restrictions. But secondly, and more importantly, at least we're giving money to fight AIDS, which is something that cannot be said to China, and we're giving that money to fight AIDS programs as opposed to supporting the ganja weed. Those are your true alternatives, whether or not the US is going to have a somewhat imperfect social policy, or whether or not you're going to have China in the future dominating entirely. That said, they seem to pretend that that's actually not going to happen. They think that there's going to be these regional actors, and there's going to be all this equality, and as a result of the equality, everybody's just going to get along. I haven't made an argument yet, but if you want to, sure.
America has been far more expansionist in terms of foreign policy than China ever has. America's been the biggest aggressive actor in terms of initiating wars and conflicts in the last 30 years. China hasn't done any of those things, so what are you arguing from?
Yeah, China's not an economic power yet because we've been dominant for the past 30 years. That's why, okay? Yes, China hasn't done it yet because they're not there yet, okay? They will be soon, okay? This is what the alternatives are. Furthermore, I would actually put out the very bold proposition that a number of American wars have been in fact just. World War II, for example. We think it's okay to have committed a number of US forces to fight the Nazis in Europe. We think in general that we at least have some sort of dialogue about human rights. We also think in general that we put sanctions on bad regimes as opposed to funding them. That said, more importantly though, about what would these large-scale numbers of regional actors entail? We think it's a myth to suppose that when you have a large number of equal actors operating, it's not going to create some sorts of problems where they don't get along. We think the clearest example of having a number of equal actors operating within a limited region is Europe in the build-up to World War I. When you have people of equal economic power and equal military power competing so quickly with one another, they're not really deterred by anybody. They're not really going to feel that there's anybody directing them in some broad vision of the world. As a result, their conflicts don't get resolved because many of their conflicts are irresolvable. So what ends up happening in the end? They end up struggling amongst one another. We would say that we're willing to put up with the occasional mistake by U.S. foreign policy, provided at the very least we have spread free speech throughout most of the world. We have kept the internet mainly free. We have defended sea lanes for every single country, not only our own. We have spread broader ideals of free trade. We don't think that they can guarantee that these regional actors will do the same. Why is this? Because what's really going to happen is you're not going to have lots of equal countries throughout the entire world, because some countries will be naturally economically stronger than others. So basically what's going to happen instead is you'll have sort of regional powers, not at this time, in charge of specific areas. Brazil in South America, perhaps, the United States in North America. When this happens, you're still going to have the type of regional superpower happening, pushing down everybody else in the very same region. The difference from the status quo, so basically everybody's going to end up getting dominated. The difference is there's still going to be large numbers, there going to be a large number of people of dominating actors. So why is this bad? Because not every single actor who's going to become the regional power is necessarily going to have the same broad liberal ideals. China in East Asia, probably not going to be promoting free speech, not at this time. No, Brazil, in Latin American countries, not as committed to free trade as we are, probably going to be adopting more of a mercantilist policies than we are. Now, they bring up the fact that we oppress Mexico. How is that going to change if the U.S. economic power declines? We're still going to be the regionally dominant power in North America. We think further that there's still going to that the international institutions will cease to function if everybody is on somewhat more equal footing. No, thank you. Why do we say this? Because these international institutions don't function well right now, and if they don't have any impetus to act, which they're not going to if there's no strong power leading them, then we don't think they're going to be able to make real decisions. Sure.
Let's be honest, the international institutions that you accredit non-functionality to, the United States hasn't been forefront in its efforts to improve the functioning of those institutions. If anything, that belies a selfish aim that they've been spreading these ideas, dressing them up as ideals and selling them as pups to the world.
So we created the UN. Also, I would point out that the EU hasn't really been taking a very broad stand in terms of like genocide and things like that. Last time I checked, the US were people who actually sent in a lot of people across the Atlantic to help stop the bombings in the Balkans, to help stop the genocide in the Balkans, even when many in Europe were standing aside. Recognize also that many of these institutions were failing to react while these many problems were occurring. At the very least, you might be right. We might not be supporting the international institutions that are created to safeguard peace and liberal ideals in general. But at the very least, on your side of the house, these institutions aren't going to be effective either, because they're all going to have irreconcilable aims. The difference, though, is, at least on our side of the house, we'll have one actor that at least has strong ideals that can promote them throughout the world. This is better than having a number of regional actors who have competing ideals, many of which are not liberal, and they can put these on everybody else. Let's quickly look at the fallout of American economic dominance. Because we are willing to accept that the U.S. is often irresponsible. We think the Iraq War is a very strong example of this. The reason why is simple. We think whenever there's a change in economic dominance structure, whenever an actor starts to fall from power, what ends up happening is they start to feel very insecure about their power as such and become more militaristic. We saw this with, the UK being very willing to go to war with Germany in time of World War I. We saw this with the US invading Iraq. We see this still with the huge defense budget of the United States. We think the fallout from America falling from power is such that there might be more wars in the near future. You might not like us, but you're certainly not going to like it when we're going down. And for that, we are proud to oppose.
The final speaker now on behalf of Trinity College's Shane O'Menabar.
Mr. Chairman, sorry.
I always feel using the word chairman to describe a former ambassador and a former Taoiseach is very, very bland and very boring. I apologise, Mr. Chairman, that I haven't thought of something more interesting to call you before coming up, and I hope that you'll appreciate that I did give it my best thoughts and efforts. Mr. Auditor, ladies and gentlemen of the College Historical Society, ladies and gentlemen, I move a motion tonight, ladies and gentlemen, that we rename this event from now on the annual Don Quixote Memorial Debate. Coming fresh from battle against another former hegemon, that is the United Kingdom, before Christmas, when we tilted against windmills bravely and carried the day, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, we alight our steeds today with lances and run against the windmills of the mighty, yet not so dominant, hegemon that is the United States. And I can tell you, that took a lot of thinking. Pronouncing hegemon is a tough one on the tongue. Before I've got a weird mind, you might have guessed from the first 30 or 40 seconds. And when Josh got up and he started talking about all these viable alternatives, I couldn't help visualising the cartoons that the Irish Times would draw when they're describing these alternatives. So he painted China as this kind of overzealous, oil-pumping gerbil on a wheel, running, and they can't get there fast enough. And then he talked about Russia, and I just thought of Mr. Putin. And then he talked about OPEC, and I had this picture of oil-stained sheiks walking around the desert with machine guns in their hands. And then finally he talked about the EU, which was just a gaggle of geese squawking incessantly all the time. And I kept saying to myself, I mean, what an excellent tactic. He's thrown all these alternatives out in front of us and said, no, because this will affect the integrity of our world. And then he painted this picture of the United States as this benevolent, old, bearded man looking out for everyone. And one thing's for certain, ladies and gentlemen, of our experience in this country of the last 5 years, the last person you should touch is a benevolent-looking, old, bearded man. More importantly, this got me, because he said, what's the alternative? The fact of the matter is that throughout this entire debate, they haven't accepted that the economic dominance has declined already. The alternative is emerging. The G8 has now transformed into the G20. The European Union, that gaggle of squawking geese, has now actually got an external action service in place. A high representative that nobody can name, fair enough, but a high representative for foreign affairs nonetheless. So this point about the viable alternative that we have to prove falls flat in its face. Because, ladies and gentlemen, it is there. The viable alternative is transpiring. No one said it would happen overnight. No one said it would be painless. I'm reliably informed it's like giving birth, which incurs an awful lot of pain. I'll never know it, ladies and gentlemen, but I'm reliably informed nonetheless. And Josh, because it makes me really angry when I look at the United States and I think about what it's supposed to stand for, and I think of those brave patriots who threw those chests of tea into the Atlantic Ocean over 200 years ago. When I think of those taglines, life, liberty, and the right to pursue happiness, ladies and gentlemen, and the way the presidents in the United States have taken these beautiful ideas, the same ideas that Josh referred to as John Adams, they've taken them, and they've dressed all sorts of horrible policies, awful forces, and said, this is good, because we've wrapped it in the mantle of noble ideas. For so long, the United States was a symbol, was a beacon to the world that yes, free speech is a good thing. Yes, if you work hard enough, you will succeed. That yes, success is rewarded. But we don't see that anymore. They've let us down, ladies and gentlemen. And that makes me really, really angry. The greatest human experiment in building a country from scratch that had so much potential, so much vision, has disappeared. And it has now fallen into the case that, as Niall said, that it goes from the schizophrenic, the radical, back to the other end again. And then he pointed out that Mr. Obama has been elected, and that is a beautiful thing for the world. That vision is on the horizon, that hope will happen. And then we go and read the news about Mr. Obama's reforms. And the fact that because Mr. Brown very successfully won the seat in Massachusetts, now the Democrats are in a position where they won't get an awful lot of those reforms through. That this idea that Obama represents the new America is absolute bunkum. He doesn't. Because there's as many people in the United States that disagree with Mr. Obama as voted for him at the moment, possibly more. And that is the problem, ladies and gentlemen. That we look to the United States to provide leadership first on so many things in the past. And that's why they got into that position of economic dominance. But they've let us down. Abu Ghraib happened, they stood over and they took it. Guantanamo happened, they stood back and they took it. They didn't publicly outcry, ladies and gentlemen. They say Bush is gone. Bush was re-elected after 4 years. And then they give us this idea, ladies and gentlemen, that, we spread our ideas. Okay? And this one we particularly like. And they said, the occasional mistake. You see, it's not an occasional mistake. Because values in the United States, when it comes to talking with other countries, are predicated entirely on economic values. The Saudi Arabians, that beacon of free speech. Mr. Pinochet, sit down. There's a few more acts. Mr. Pinochet in Chile. The Taliban in Afghanistan. Syria. Bolivia. Indonesia. Let's not forget Mr. Hussein in Iraq and Mr. Rumsfeld sending him those weapons. They weren't the ideals that John Adams spoke about, but they were dressed up in the same mantle that those ideals were sold to the rest of the world. You see, the problem is, ladies and gentlemen, and let's bring you back to this idea of what the American way has come on. And Ruth and I have done an excellent job, and they really have, in reeling off all the facts and figures that you need to know about this debate. I'm here to give you the big picture, the blue skies element of what we're discussing tonight. This American way has been bastardized. The rigidity and the ideological rigidity of a nation that is supposed to embrace disparate points of view, that is supposed to hold up high the virtue of freedom of speech, has disappeared. Do you know what they have in the United States now? They have free speech zones. Free speech zones in the country that gave us the First Amendment. Areas where you are not allowed protest against the leaders you elect. And they have the temerity in the United States government to tell us that they spread ideas that they don't even believe in themselves. If that's not a bastardization, then I don't know what is, Alex.
Sir, if regional powers were allowed to run amok as they would on your side of the house, Iraq would still be in charge of Kuwait. Indonesia would still be oppressing its people. At least we do promote ideals some of the time. That can't happen with you.
Without pointing to the glaring inconsistency there, that Iraq might never have occupied Kuwait had it not been given weapons by the American government. And I'll get back to that in a second. He talks about regional actors and how they won't work. Well, I suppose in the United States, they know all about that, given the pig's ear they've made of actually making NAFTA work for countries like Mexico, and actually making free trade agreements work around the world. And then they throw in again they point to the EU, ladies and gentlemen, as this example of an association that won't work. In Australia, the Australian Prime Minister is leading calls to now form an Asia-Pacific Council. And they're saying it won't work because you'll have all these multipolar people running around and they won't be reconciling with each other at all. But the fact of the matter is, that's happening anyway. The G20 is there. It embraces. It's no longer the G8. It's no longer the big boys clubs. It is now a club that involves all these different associations. Oh, thank you. Sit down. You've had your 18 minutes. So, you see, and another great international institution's arrogant. I put it to Alex, I think it was, and I said to him, Alex, you talk about the non-functioning of these international institutions. And he replied to me, and I was pretty taken. I thought it was a great answer. He said, well, we created the UN. And I was expecting for another crowd-stopping performance to kind of back up that argument. He didn't. He just said, we created the UN. They didn't reform it, ladies and gentlemen, when it needed reform. And that's the problem. They don't sign up to the ICC. And he told us that there's no guarantee that regional actors will do the right thing when it comes to human rights or whatever. But the thing is, we've no guarantee the United States will do that either. They don't sign up to the ICC. They have no interest in taking part in the United Nations. And when it comes to it, they are absolutely economically driven when it comes to putting their values overseas. To such an extent that we don't know what those values are anymore. That they pall on this idea that we're the only country that's able to sort these problems out for you. And they say, we are the world cop, but only when it suits us. They didn't send soldiers into Darfur in Sudan in time. That was a letdown. That was from the World Cup. But in the same breath, they'll tell you it's acceptable that they go into countries where they want. I don't like having to make this speech. The United States was a beacon of what a human experiment in forming a country would be. They've let themselves down. And it will take a long, long time to rebuild that trust that they can and will act in the benevolent interest of the world. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why once again in our steeds with our lances, we run towards these windmills and we commend this motion to the House. Thank you.
gentlemen around me, thank you very much for coming here today. I suppose I should start out addressing the notion that I am a windmill. I'm not quite spinning, that'll come a little bit later, though I'm a little bit sad about the fact that we are amidst a U.S. economic decline because I can't afford quite as much Guinness or Jameson as I would have been able to several decades ago. So what we would say then on our side of the house, though, is that what this notion of us being in decline right now belies is the idea that all of these problems that that we've heard sort of repeated in a litany from this side of the house, and I'll address you guys too, you seem like nice people, have not come to pass. We have not seen the economic prosperity and uptick that they've talked about. We have not seen these choices being made by these individuals that they claim will come to pass. And we, from the American side of the pond, believe that this elucidates precisely the failure of apolarity or multipolarity, whichever it is, that occurs without a dominant economic force, particularly one such as the UN, which specifically when we're talking about economics has actually stood as a beacon. So let's look to this notion of culture and first of all, why I don't believe it really belongs in this debate, but second of all, why I think that just because they're winning the battle on cool accents doesn't necessarily mean that they win the cultural portion of the round. So first, what we would say is that we believe that sort of what we've heard from this side is basically a debate about hating on the U.S. and the U.S. policies that have been taken and all of these bad things that happened under the Reagan administration when Reagan was using the litany of we are a beacon on a hill to basically cloak the fact that we were selling guns to the Contras and funding the Iraqis and doing all of these other things that we hear in this last speech, right? What we would note on our side of the house is that we believe, first of all, as we've told you repeatedly, that this is no truer of China, who's influxing capital into the IMF to overcapitalize and create bubbles similar to the one that was just created in the United States in all of these other countries with much more fragile economies. Better than the EU, hyper-regulating other countries and propping up failing industries, much as it does with, say, the milk farming in France, right? We would say that all of these other choices are equally as bad from an economic and equally as hypocritical from a cultural standpoint, insofar China going green is basically just a way that they're using to mask the fact that they're red and supporting the Janjaweed in Sudan. We think that this is something that's incredibly problematic to stand for, and we think that all of these choices necessarily pale in comparison to the devil you know, the devil that's been driving the economy since post-World War I, or post-World War II, at the very least. We think that this has kept things functioning in a manner that is actually consistent, particularly because, in an economic sphere, the United States, no thank you, has been specifically consistent. And what do we mean by this? We hear this from Josh, right? What we're talking about when we speak of American economic dominance is not necessarily this idea of America should always have the greatest GDP and have everything it wants and all of these other sorts of things. That's not the line that we're cutting on our side of the house. What we're telling you is that we believe that an economy such as the United States is dominant when it spreads its economic ideals in a manner that does things such as, police the Strait of Malacca and the Suez Canal, which combined provide for 80% of the world's oil transporting through them in a year and 60% of world trade. It's when the United States supports the business class and the United Nations and all of these other countries and upholds the concept of liberalism. The idea that when we're having dialogues, be they trade or be they otherwise, with bureaucrats from other countries, we're much less likely to fight each other. It's the idea that keeping, and I can't believe I'm quoting this, the beacon on the hill relit, because we agree with their side of the house, that back in the 1970s and the 1980s, there were a lot of mistakes made. And what we believe is that a lot of the current mistakes are mopping up those mistakes that were made in the past, right? We would look to Iraq, too, as mopping up the problems with the Taliban. We would even look to the corn subsidies as mopping up our not aiding Mexico sooner by feeding people in Ciudad Juarez, where there's currently a massive drug trafficking war going on. Yes, it's partially funded by the corn lobby, but it's not just about United States dominance. It's about helping poor people who can't get money because they're being oppressed by drug lords just as well. We think that all of these things are good things to hope for, and if you still had something to say, you're welcome to it.
Isn't it worse, though, that you're using that stream to export exploit people. That like in order for people to get help, they have to sign up to a Washington consensus that increases debts.
Right, but here's the thing. They don't have to in a lot of instances, right? The United States has seen time and time again that sanctions don't always work, that sometimes you have to give aid to other individuals. We would look to examples as recent as Botswana, right? Where they were attempting to pass a bill illegalizing homosexuality and making sodomy punishable by death. What we saw was that the United States response, when they attempted to sanction, that didn't even pass because they knew that it would not have in fact been an effective sanction to actually stop these kinds of things from going on. The United States has recognized, at least in some limited capacity, with the overturn of the administration, that these sorts of things can't be recapitulated. We think that when your alternative to a dictator, yes, perhaps, but one that is benevolent and at least has some interests of other people in mind, is either a multipolar world where you're choosing between a bunch of dictators, all of who are competing to see who can mess you up the worst and get away with it the most, or an apolar world where you're basically forced, as South Korea did, to be completely protectionist, and a world where complete protectionism will no longer work, as evidenced by the massive failure of the majority of South America after their post-1950 attempts to build up their own economies in a similar manner. We think that these sorts of issues are going to be particularly, problematic. We think that when you are faced with these sorts of issues, what you would prefer is a unipolar world. A world where at least, even if the person that you're counting on isn't necessarily the most perfect or the best or even the most consistent, that individual is always there. So let's note this, let's talk about foreign concerns a little bit, because this is something that we hear primarily from the second speaker. And in true American fashion, I'm mainly going to focus on the foreign concerns and how they relate to America, and sort of frame that out elsewhere. So what we believe on our side of the house is what we hear about the United States being evil and sort of trying to dominate everybody. Like, I don't necessarily believe that that's true, right? Like, we certainly haven't been trying to dominate the European Union, the second largest market in the world. Like, we're trying to work with individuals on these sorts of issues. What we would say then is that all this idea of coercivity, all of these other things that we hear about how the U.S. is uniquely bad for these sorts of reasons, simply aren't true, or if they are true, they're true of any other seeking sort of factor within a political system. What we would say then is that this is equally true in the sense of schizophrenia, right? Like, any democratic country is going to have schizophrenia, and particularly in America, where the political parties are constantly pandering towards the middle, right? We see that it's actually vastly less schizophrenic in a lot of policies than most other countries are. So at least we're only shaking a little bit and not shaking a lot. Go ahead.
Do you know what the way to cure schizophrenia is?
No, I don't.
Lots of regional actors actually working to put checks and balances on each other.
Right, but here's the problem with the regional actors, right? All of the regional actors that will take control after the fall of America are regional actors whose interests massively divert, and regional actors who are very balanced sort of in terms of militarily and economically. What we think happens then is we get miscalculations. And particularly in regions like South America, we get Venezuela and Brazil fighting. Or in regions like the Middle East, we get Iran and, I guess, the new Iraq, or Iran and Saudi Arabia fighting. Basically, anybody who used to have a pro-US stance is now going to be preyed upon by those who don't have an alliance with the US, who now feel that they have the moral superiority to prey on the falling US protectorates in a manner that actually would benefit them, particularly because they believe that these protectorates are no longer backed by the guns of the United States, or certainly not as surfately as they were before. We think that this is an incredible problem to spread across these regional dynamics, and we think the dynamics of power that are going to result for that are going to be absolutely catastrophic. So yes, proposition, we would prefer the devil we know to the devil we don't, because at least with the devil we know what's happening. We don't know when the US finally sort of bows out and admits that it can't police the Strait of Malacca anymore, that it can't support the United Nations anymore, that it can't single-handedly deal with the IMF and its distribution anymore. When those signals finally get out to the rest of the international community, what will happen? That what will happen is a terrifying question, particularly in regions such as, South Asia, where we have instances of actors with nuclear weapons, in China, where we have instances of a country that has a massive stockpile of capital and absolutely no check on how it can use it, in instances all across the world. We think that all of these instances are completely problematic for all of the reasons we've elucidated. And ladies and gentlemen of this House, Mr. Chairman, judges, guys up there, we're incredibly proud to oppose this motion.
Jamie Papa, who is with the Foreign Service Officer at the U.S. Department of State. And to her right, we have Vinay Nair, who is a former debate convener of the SER in 1999. So with that, I'd like to invite you to retire.
Thanks very much. I'd like, if I may, first of all, to compliment the speakers who took part in this debate. It was a very spirited debate. I have to say, I have particular sympathy with the American participants having to defend their own country from various angles, and others having the luxury of attacking it from any angle they chose. I think, first of all, we should draw a distinction between military and economic dominance. The United States has been the dominant economic power in the world since about 1890. It was the biggest economy in the world by then. It had overtaken Britain, and it was not only resource rich, but rich in every other respect by a long distance ahead of competing economies. The United States, in contrast, did not become militarily dominant in the world until about 1944. It was very reluctant to accompany its economic dominance with a commensurate military dominance. And one might, I think, properly ask oneself, why did the United States choose to become militarily dominant and to use its economic power for military purposes? I think to find an answer to that question, you probably ought to look at what happened between 1914 and 1918, when we Europeans were in charge and we brought upon ourselves a very serious global war. And what happened as well in the period from 1939 to December of 1941, when again we Europeans were unable to deal with issues concerning the independence of Poland and the protection of minorities in Czechoslovakia and other places. The United States is, or at least was, reluctant to become a military hegemon. Let us consider what would have happened if the United States had not become a military hegemon, if the United States had not provoked Japan, and it did provoke Japan, into attacking in December of 1941. Supposing President Roosevelt had said, we must keep America out of this war, we ought not interest ourselves unduly on what the Japanese are doing in China. And remember, it was because of China and not Europe that America entered the war. We'll take a hands-off approach. What would have happened? I'm pretty sure what would have happened would have been that Hitler would have gone ahead and attacked the Soviet Union as he did, and he would have been beaten by the Soviet Union. And if that had happened, you would have had the Soviet Republic of France, the Soviet Republic of Belgium, the Soviet Republic of Luxembourg, and quite possibly the Soviet Republic of England and Scotland and Wales and even Ireland. So I think we should be glad that the United States decided to give over its previous attempt at remaining, despite being economically dominant, not militarily dominant. Well, the United States has continued to be militarily dominant ever since. And the critical theatre, I think, in which the United States remains by any stretch dominant is in space. The dominance of space is in the 21st century what the dominance of the oceans was in the 19th and 20th century. The United States controls space. And the thing that causes the greatest anxiety to the United States is not the build-up of the Chinese Navy, it's not even the possibility of Iran acquiring a nuclear weapon, and I must say I don't understand why everybody is quite as obsessed that they are at one more country in the Middle East acquiring a nuclear weapon, given that Pakistan and India and Israel already, and Russia already have nuclear weapons. But I think what the United States is really concerned about is the possibility that China could start shooting down US satellites. If that happened, the possibility of basically undermining the entire global positioning, global control of the environment around the world that the United States currently is able to exercise would be brought to an end. What we must ask ourselves, I think, is if there is to remain US military dominance, I think US economic dominance is on the way out. Anyway, it's on the way out because the US population is not growing as fast as the populations of other parts of the world. It's on the way out because the United States has promoted membership of the World Trade Organization by countries like China and India and soon Russia, and thereby brought huge numbers of additional people into the global workforce who are now competing with and taking the jobs of American and European workers, but in the process have brought untold prosperity to countries outside Europe and North America, which they would not have got if global free trade had not been established, as it was in pursuit of US policy by the United States. That being the case, however, I think we've got to ask ourselves, is the United States fitted internally to exercise the sort of leadership that inevitably it is exercising because of its current position? And I would argue that it is not. The United States is a 21st century power operating with an 18th century constitution. The US Constitution, which allows one senator to block an appointment to an incoming administration, which requires for any treaty to be adopted that 2/3 of the Senate must vote for it, or else the United States cannot adhere to it, thereby finding us without US membership of the League of Nations, thereby finding us without a climate change agreement in Copenhagen, because the United States has a constitution designed to prevent things happening. The purpose of the US Constitution is not to create governance, but to prevent governance. It is to ensure the minimum amount of government and the minimum amount of entanglement of the United States in rules made by others. And I would contend that if the United States wishes to continue to give the sort of lead that it has placed itself in a position to give, it needs dramatically to reform its very antique constitutional arrangements, which essentially prevent that country from making decisions. One can jolly along for many years in some cases without making decisions. But I think the world has now become so interdependent in the matter of disease, spreading from one country to the other, in the matter of climate changing effects affecting other countries as well as one's own, in the matter of people travelling from one country and terrorists travelling from another country to another, that we do now need effective global rules. And I believe that the United States Senate in particular is an obstacle in its present power to the operation of the United States as an appropriate leader in the position that it is in. I'm not going to detain you much longer because I know that we're not far away from having a decision from the judges. But I would want to make one or two points about some of the things that were said in the debate. I think it is important in regard to the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, to make the point that the original impetus for NAFTA came from Mexico. It was Mexico that proposed that there be a North American Free Trade Agreement. And there is. Unfortunately, the United States has not been very good at implementing the decisions that are made against certain US trade practices by the adjudicating authorities in NAFTA. And that illustrates one of the problems that the United States has, that it finds it very difficult to accept rules or decisions made outside the United States. But if we are to have global rulemaking, and if we're to have a means of managing global interdependence, everybody, including the United States, has got to be willing to accept decisions made by global institutions. Another criticism, and this is the last criticism I would make of the United States, is that it is not paying its debts to the United Nations. It is one of the richest countries in the world, and President Obama's budget, published yesterday, does not provide for the United States paying its dues, money that it owes, debts that it owes to the United Nations. And while the United Nations is open to criticism, I think it is not fair for any country, particularly a rich country like the United States, to be in arrears, as it is currently to the United States. I'm now happy to announce that the judges are ready to announce their decision. Wherever the judges may be, I will...
Before we have the judges, I'd like to call on Jason Somerville, the editor of the Student Economic Review, to make an announcement. Okay, with that then, I think we will have the judges in 30 seconds.
Great announcement.
Okay, so do you want to put the motion in place?
Okay. Right. The motion before the House is that this House welcomes the decline in US economic dominance. Would those who are in favour of the motion please say aye? Aye. Those who are opposed, say nay. Nay. I can make no decision on that, so I must call for a show of hands. The volume on either side was equal. So could I ask those in favour of the motion to raise one hand?
Sure, we can't just shout again.
Against the motion?
I didn't count the first time.
The motion is carried by a small margin.
Sorry?
What? 3 seconds or 10 minutes?
Let's go. If it was 10 seconds, I'd order this to
In terms of paying its debts, what do you think? How is money primarily?
Well, there's a huge amount of resistance in Congress to the United Nations. I think it's a plot overpower American power. Really, I mean, that's a debate that's been going on in the United States forever, right back to not all the feds, just anyway, that's not the decision. But that has to change. That's the... well, I mean, we're not going to achieve that in our lifetime, but I mean, it's more, I think we've got to move ever so slowly in that direction. I mean, we already are there.